In this video, I play 2-5 at the Aria in a special meetup game hosted by Brad Owen and Johnnie Vibes. Watch as I get into some big hands and even end up at Brad Owen's table. In the first hand, I have ace deuce of diamonds and there's an under the gun open for $15. The hijack calls and we decide to come along in the cutoff and make the call. The button also calls. The flop comes ace, king, 7, 2 clubs. Action checks to me, and with a weak kicker, I don't want to bet here and inflate the pot, so I just check and the button checks back. The turn is a deuce of spades. We now have 2 pair, and this time the under the gun player bets $45 into about 60. The hijack folds and action comes to us. Having diamonds here, I unblock all of the draws like clubs and spades, and now that I have 2 pair, I definitely want to raise. My opponent can still have tons of hands that he calls a raise here with, like draws or even some random ace-x. I decide to go on the bigger side. I make it 190. The button folds and action goes back to the under the gun player. They think it over, but eventually make the fold. My raise was definitely on the larger side, but not having a club or spade, I think it was fine. Next up, we have pocket kings, and there is a middle position open for $15. We 3-bet from the big blind to $65, and my opponent makes the call. Everyone's main fear with pocket kings becomes a reality as the flop comes ace, jack, 4. With an ace on flop, I'm just going to start with a check, and my opponent checks back. The turn is the 3 of clubs. I decide to check here once again as the flush comes in, and my opponent can still have an ace. They check back once again. The river is the deuce of clubs. Now with 4 clubs on board and us not having a single club, I am once again going to check and hope my opponent checks back. Which they indeed do, as we show our hand and end up being good. In hindsight, I think I could have bet the turn for protection. A really terrible run out for pocket kings. In the next hand, we have king 10 of clubs and raise on the cutoff to $20. The button makes a call. The flop comes king 6, 6, 2 hearts. Being that my kicker is not too strong, I go ahead and start with the check. My opponent bets $30 and I make the call. The turn is the 9 of diamonds. I check again, and this time my opponent bets $105, which is just a bit over pot. Once again, I just make the call. The river comes the ace of spades. Not that bad of a card, considering the only ace my opponent should really have is ace-x suited, like a heart draw or diamond draw. I check once again. My opponent thinks it over and this time decides to check back. I show my hand and end up being good as my opponent mucks. In the next hand, we have another premium, pocket aces this time. We raise under the gun 1 to $20. The button 3-bets to $60. Being pretty deep here at 1k effective to start the hand, I am definitely going to 4-bet. I make it 170. My opponent makes a call. The flop comes queen 9, 4. Really not happy to see a queen, as pocket queens and kings are certainly in my opponent's range. I start off with a check and my opponent checks back. The turn is the ace of clubs. We now have top set, but a 3rd club does now come in for a flush. I'm really not too concerned with this, it's just something to note. I check once again, hoping my opponent bets, but they don't, they check back. The river is the 6 of spades. With about $340 in the pot, it's time to go for value. I bet $300. This is meant to be a very polarizing sizing, meaning it's either a complete bluff or complete value, like in this case. Unfortunately, my opponent ends up folding. I think if I were to play this hand again, I would bet the flop, and if I didn't bet the flop, I should certainly be betting the turn. In the next hand, we actually have pocket aces again. Time to redeem ourselves and get more value than last time. The under the gun 1 player raises to $20. We 3-bet from the small blind to $70. And the big blind 4-bets to $220. The early position raiser folds and actions back to us. We are about $800 effective with this player. I could just call if I thought my opponent was capable of having bluffs here, but I don't think they are. I just want to get it in here and cooler a hand like pocket queens or kings or ace king. I jam all in and my opponent makes the call. The flop comes jack 6, 3. The turn is the 3 of diamonds and the river is the 8 of clubs. I turn my hand over and as expected, win. We take down a nearly $1,700 pot. Next up, we have ace king off and we raise under the gun to $20. The button makes a call and the big blind 3-bets to $105. We are about 1k effective to start this hand and I just make the call. The button calls as well and we are going 3 ways to a flop that comes king 10, 7. The big blind continues and bets 150 into about 315. Kind of scary to see this person betting into 2 opponents like this, but obviously not going anywhere with top pair. We make the call and the button folds. The turn is a jack of diamonds. This time my opponent slows down and checks. There could be an argument for betting for value, but I think that's too thin, especially considering my opponent bet so large on the flop. I decide to check back for pot control and the river is a jack of hearts. This time my opponent checks once again. Time to go for some value. I bet small, 125. This targets worse King X as well as worse pairs. Hands like King Queen or Pocket Queens I think would be most likely. My opponent eventually calls. I'm guessing he had one of the types of hands we mentioned, as he definitely took a long time to call. Next up, I have Ace King again, and this time the hijack raises to $20. The button 3-bets to $60, and we end up 4-betting to $200 from the small blind. It folds back around to the button, who ends up making the call. We are only $900 effective with this player, so not much room to do a whole lot here. The flop comes Queen 7-3 2 hearts. With 420 in the pot, I decide to bet 125. This is just a range bet and something that I would do with Queens plus here. Therefore, I can do the same thing with a bluff such as Ace King. There's also a lot of good turn cards. My opponent makes a call and the turn is the 7 of diamonds. This is not one of those great cards, so I slow down and check. My opponent ends up checking back. The river is a jack of hearts. With the king of hearts myself, I could go for a bluff here, but my opponent could very well have pocket jacks, which obviously would have just rivered a boat. With ace king, we block aces and kings, and I would expect my opponent to bet queens on the turn. So it's really only pocket tens or pocket jacks, maybe ace queen that they have. Of these hands, the only hand that I can really get to fold is pocket tens. For this reason, I shut down and check. My opponent checks back, and unfortunately for us, this is one of those times where my opponent had pocket tens. We will lose this nearly $700 pot. Next up, we have king queen off in the big blind, and the cutoff raises to $20. I just make the call. The flop comes queen 10-7. I check and my opponent bets $25 with about 40 in the pot. With top pair, decent kicker, I am going to bump it up here. I raise to $85. My opponent makes a call. The turn is the 10 of spades. With over $200 in this pot, I am going to bet here, but going to bet small. I bet $60. I'm betting for value, but also blocking a bit as my opponent can have a 10. This does the trick as my opponent makes the fold. In the last hand at this table, the hijack raises to $15. We 3-bet to $50 on the button, and the big blind 4-bets to $180. The hijack folds and actions back to us. This is kind of a large sizing, but I'm definitely not going to fold pocket jacks, especially at Brad Owen's meetup game. I make the call and the flop comes ace 10-4 2 hearts. My opponent continues and bets 125 into almost 400. If I didn't have a heart here, I may consider just folding, but I think it's too tight to fold a 1 bet, so I make the call. The turn is the ace of clubs. This is a relatively good card for me, but when my opponent checks, I don't think there's really any reason to bet. I check back. The river is the 9 of spades. This time, my opponent bets 150 into about 600. This is kind of a similar spot as earlier in the 3-bet pot where I had ace king and got value on the river for a very small bet. My opponent could be doing that here with an ace, but he could also just be block betting with a hand like pocket kings or pocket queens. He could be getting value from a hand like I have, while also protecting his hand. We could turn our hand into a bluff here by jamming, but I don't think there's any point in doing that when we didn't bet the turn. And if I make this call, I'm just going to be beat most of the time by a better pair or an ace. I fold and do not let my opponent get the very thin value. With that, we are late into the night and I end up changing tables and finding Brad Owen. Unfortunately, I could not get any hands with Brad and he ended up racking up and leaving a short time after I arrived. It was still cool nonetheless to see and play with Brad. The table eventually breaks and it's time to cash out. Alright guys, pretty good session. We were in for $1,000, cashed out for $24.17, so almost a $1,500 profit. Pretty nice, pretty nice. We did get to play with Brad Owen at the end of the night. Unfortunately, didn't have any hands, any even close hands we could play with him. I would have called it pretty wide, but we didn't really have anything we could play with him. So we will have to get more hands with him next time. But if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you thought. Let's go.